Hey everybody, welcome back to another wine series. We're actually going to do things a little bit differently this week. I mentioned on Saturday that we're going to start pre-recording a couple of the information sessions and slides just to get that information out so you can peruse and listen as you can. That way, when we get to our tastings on Saturdays, we're able to just focus on any questions you might have, really get into the tasting and the interaction there, but also that way anyone who's not available on Saturday afternoons who might be interested in learning a little something or just being a part of it can get some of the information as well. But so this week we're going to do sparkling wines. Sparkling wines is one of my favorite things to drink. It's anything bubbles is much more fun in my opinion. But in America, at least our culture, we seem to find a need to have to drink champagne and other sparklings. It's usually weddings, anniversaries, big parties, things like that. Other countries and cultures really just drink sparkling whenever they want to. It's fantastic to pair with just about anything. And it's fun. It's a nice bubbly drink. So there are actually 6 main methods that we see sparkling wines being made. 4 of these are much more prevalent than 2 of them. So I'm going to talk about the 2 that are a little strange right now. The first one is the carbonation method. Carbonation method is very similar to what you would probably think for like sparkling waters, sodas, things like that. They actually put a still wine into a pressurized tank and just fill that tank with as much CO2 as they can. And eventually that CO2 infuses into the wine itself. This is usually used for some lower quality wines and stuff that they make in a lot of bulk. So think of like Cook's or Corbel that you would see in grocery stores. Another method that you might not see very often, something you're probably not too familiar with, is the continuous method. The continuous method is probably one of the weirdest and funkiest ways to make a sparkling wine. It's actually also called the Russian method because it originated in Russia. Essentially what they do in the continuous method is as they're fermenting their wine into a sparkling wine, they continuously add more and more yeast and yeast additives until it reaches a high enough pressure. So it's just this continuous process of adding yeast every so often to increase pressure. It actually comes out, the final product, tasting a little similar to champagne. It has those bready, yeasty tones. But again, it's a really weird, funky, not very often used type of method. The other 4 are what you're going to see just about everywhere. The first one is the traditional method, or method champenoise. This is the method that you're going to end up seeing champagne being made in. This is what you'll see cava, which is the Spanish version of champagne, essentially. It's not champagne unless it's made in the Champagne region of France. So cava is also in the method champenoise. But what they'll do for most sparkling wines, but particularly in traditional method, is they'll harvest the grapes a little bit early, so that way it doesn't reach peak ripeness. One of the main grapes in Champagne is Chardonnay. And as we talked about last week, Chardonnay doesn't have a whole lot of natural acidity. So they want to try to preserve as much of that bright acidicness in these grapes before they ferment. So they'll pick it a little bit earlier, and then they'll ferment it into a very dry wine. Once they have a dry, still wine, they'll do something called a tirage, which is an addition of sugar and yeast into the bottle. And so this will essentially activate a second fermentation inside of the bottle. And then it'll be aged on the lees between 9 months to 5 years. Just depends on the quality, depends on the style, what the champagne house is looking for. So while it's being aged, it'll go through a process called riddling. Riddling is a very slow, methodical turning of the bottle as it's being aged. And essentially what they're trying to do is get all the yeast and all the sediment down to the neck of the bottle. So then once they're done riddling, they'll actually freeze the neck of the bottle. They'll be submerging it into a very cold liquid. So it'll freeze all of the sediment at the base of the bottle, and they'll just gorge it. So they'll pop the top, the sediment will fly out, and then they'll add something called the dosage. Dosage is a addition of sugar, which allows it to get to the style of sweetness that they would prefer. So you can see on the little chart here, there's a couple different versions of dosage. Styles, brut is what a lot of people will hear all over the place. And then they'll see dry. Dry is nowhere near the driest. And then there's demi-sec, sec, and doux, which essentially is the sweet side of sparkling and champagnes. Then you have the tank method. Tank method is also known as the Charmat method, where instead of it undergoing the second fermentation inside of a bottle, like method champenoise, it'll undergo that second fermentation inside of a pressurized tank. So it won't be aged on the lees, so it'll be a little bit of a lighter style. You don't get those bready, yeasty tones. And then it's filtered out before being bottled, and it still undergoes a dosage, again, just to adjust the final sweetness level. Something that you might see in the tank method or the Charmat method is Prosecco, which is from the northern regions of Italy. Then we have the transfer method. Transfer method is what you'll see for large and small formats of a method champenoise type of sparkling. So again, they'll still ferment out a dry, still wine, add the tirage, and then it'll undergo that second fermentation inside of the bottle. It'll be aged on the lees inside of the bottle, and then they'll pop the corks and transfer it all into a pressurized tank. From the pressurized tank, they're going to clarify and filter everything out, and then they'll start to bottle it using the dosage. But this will be used for small formats. We actually brought in a few small formats for the tasting on Saturday, and large formats is what this will be used for. So you're still getting the same type of wine, still going through the same process, but it just makes it easier to put into different bottle types, so they're not worried about trying to undergo a second fermentation inside of a tiny 187 bottle. Then finally, we have the ancestral method. Ancestral method is also known as the method rurale. This is actually what is believed to be one of the earliest forms of sparkling winemaking. So it'll undergo its first fermentation, but it'll actually stop and they'll pause fermentation midway through using really, really cold temperatures. And so they're basically aging midway through fermentation. Then at some point when they decide that they want to continue fermentation, they'll go ahead, take it away from that cold, and they'll bottle it and age, and where it then continues its fermentation inside of the bottle. Then, just like in method champenoise, they're going to riddle and disgorge the bottles, popping out any sediment, and then finally capping it off. Some popular regions in sparkling wines. The first one, of course, is Champagne. You can't talk about sparkling wine without talking about Champagne. Champagne is in France, but the Champagne region is the only region that is allowed to make champagne. Outside of that, it's sparkling wine. No one else can claim to make champagne. Champagne has three major grape varietals that you'll see: Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay. Then we have Prosecco. Prosecco comes from the northeastern region of Italy. They actually use a grape that used to be called the Prosecco grape, but they actually changed the name to Glera as a way to preserve the authenticity of Prosecco as a sparkling wine. So you'll actually see some still wines being made with Glera. So they just wanted to make sure that you didn't see a wine being made from Prosecco and think that it was going to be a sparkling wine. So just interesting little tidbit there. The next one is going to be Cava. Cava actually comes from the Catalonian region of Spain, and it uses three native grape varietals, but it also undergoes the same fermentation as Champagne, the same fermentation style, method champenoise. So you still get those fermentation notes, the yeasty breadiness, the heaviness on the palate, but because it's completely different grapes, you get a little bit more of a different flavor profile from it. So it's very, very interesting. It's one of my favorite sparklings, especially when you're looking at a value. Cava is an amazing value for the quality that it's made at. Then we have just a little bit of a tasting chart I wanted to show. So for Champagne, they're aged for a minimum of 3 years. When you're talking about like the expensive champagnes, when you're getting to like real good quality. Taste profile, of course, depends a little bit on the fermentation style. Depends on how sweet they would like it to be, but ultimately the primary flavors stay the same. And really, you can find these in, think about the types of grapes that are being used. Pinot Noir, Chardonnay. Of course, Pinot Noir is not going to be, any tannin. It's going to be fermented as a white wine. Um, so you'll start to get citruses, yellow fruits like apples and pears, almond and toast from the yeastiness and the breadiness that comes from those fermentation styles. But of course, the dryness is going to change a little bit based on what type of style they're looking for. If they're looking for something a little bit sweeter, if they're looking for a brut. Body, to me, when you're talking about champagne has a little bit more of the heavier bodies, just because again you're getting those yeasty, bready notes and tones, and very very high acidity. Then when we get into Prosecco is a little bit more of a lighter, crisper, fresher wine. You'll get a lot more of those tree fruits, melon even, but you start getting away from those yeasty tones. Notice on the primary flavors, you don't see anything that would be something that you get out of a fermentation taste profile. And so to me, this is going to be much lighter bodied. It's not going to have quite the acidity. They didn't completely drain all the sugar out of this as if they would in a brut style of a champagne. And then finally, you have Cava. If you look at the primary flavors of Cava versus the primary flavors of Chardonnay, very, very similar. You get quince, which is kind of appley, peary. It's in that same family. Lime, you're getting some citrus, yellow apple, chamomile, so you're getting some of that floral tone. But almond, again, you're getting from the yeasty, bready notes out of the fermentation styles. Then something really interesting to look at when you're buying champagnes is vintage versus non-vintage champagne. So essentially a non-vintage champagne is just a house blend that the champagne house feels that they can produce every single year. So they use this from several different years, blend everything together, so that way they're able to consistently offer the same tasting champagne year after year after year, and keep it on shelves in stores and keep it stocked in restaurants and everywhere you go. Then you start finding vintages. Vintage champagnes are really only produced in the best of the best years, which is weird because when we think wine, oftentimes we think vintage is a direct line to any and every year. Every wine has a different vintage and it continues going down. There are good vintages and bad vintages. But essentially for champagne, they save those really good years, the really good grape growth years for a specific vintage, and that'll up the price a little bit. It'll up the quality. It'll give it something a little bit different and unique, so it won't taste like the non-vintage. It'll have its own little style and characteristics. And then finally, you're getting into Prestige Cuvée. Prestige Cuvée comes from the best vineyards in Champagne. That's when you start getting into labels like Dom Perignon, something where it's fantastic years, great vintages, the best grapes from the best vineyards. Then when we're looking at styles of champagne and other sparklings, this has to do a lot with the fermentation style and the winemaking styles. So the four main groupings that you can really put for those styles are going to be dry, lean, and zesty. For me, that's like your Prosecco. It's a nice, clean, crisp wine. Then you're getting light, dry, fruity, floral. Rich, creamy, and nutty is really what you're getting with those method champenoise, where you're getting those yeast and bready. It's a little heavier. And then finally, sweet and perfumed. For me, this is when you're talking about like sparkling Lambrusco, where the style is purposely to make it fruity and sweet and kind of overwhelming on the palate, more of a dessert sparkling than anything else. And then going back into sweetness, brut is what's considered to be dry for champagne and sparkling, whereas dry is going to be a little bit on the sweeter side. Then you have sec and doux, which essentially just means sweet. That's when you're starting to get into the sweet side of things. You'll actually start to be able to taste and feel the sugar that's left in the wines. All that's important because when we're talking about food pairing with champagne and sparkling wines, champagne and sparkling really goes with anything. It's one of the reasons why I love it so much. You can really pair it with every meal that you're having. Champagne and other sparkling wines are often used as a palate cleanser. So you'll see in some like Michelin star restaurants, whenever somebody has a really rich, heavy appetizer or first course, oftentimes a chef or a som will send out a glass of sparkling just to cleanse everything off, use those bubbles and the acidity to be able to wash the palate clean so that they can actually appreciate the following dish. So it goes with everything, but at the same time, it doesn't go with everything. So it's an interesting subject when you're talking about pairing. A really easy way to pair champagne and other sparklings when you're in doubt is look for the style of champagne and the sugar level. So do you want to look for something that's going to be super, super dry or something super sweet? Do you want something that's going to be a little bit lighter and crisper where there's not a whole lot of flavor going on? Or do you want something that's a little bit more robust, like a champagne? So for instance, if you're going to be eating like a hard cheese is going to be good with something dry, something crisp, not a whole lot of flavor profile on that. Whereas a dessert, you're going to want something like a sparkling Lambrusco, something that's going to be a little sweeter, more aromatic. Champagne, with how kind of heavy and bready and yeasty it is, would pair much better with something that's a little bit more heavy. So looking at like pork, duck, even some heavier chickens that have been spiced and herbed. Um, so all that goes into what we're going to be tasting on Saturday. So Saturday, we're still offering hors d'oeuvres. We're going to do hors d'oeuvres for 2 people per order. And so we're starting with edamame hummus, and that's going to come with fried wontons, pimento cheese and bacon arancini, and then finally goat cheese and strawberry jam canapes. And again, kind of like last week, we saw how each individual food item slowly and slightly changed the wine. You started highlighting a little bit different aspects of the wine, and the wine slowly influenced a little bit of the food as well. So I want to make sure we have time to be able to talk about all that on Saturday, because you'll slowly start to see these things start to interact and change. And then we have a couple different wine selections. We just brought in the JP Chenet and the Villa Sandi. Both of those are small formats. They're 187 milliliters. So they're the small little cute bottles. But those are fantastic wines. The Blanc de Blanc is absolutely fantastic. And then we have a couple of our normal champagnes as well. The Piper Heidsieck, Veuve Clicquot, Langlois, all amazing champagnes. Highly recommend getting at least the Blanc de Blanc and the Prosecco so you can see the differences. But also, I personally can't pass up Veuve. It's to me what really, really highlights in my mind when I think of classic champagne. And then finally, just looking over the Master Somm's deductive tasting. Highly recommend, if you haven't already, to go to Guild Somm, go to their website, and print out a couple of these as you're tasting, so you can slowly keep track of what you're tasting, what you're feeling, what you're sensing. This is going to be the first time during this class that we're going to have something that has gas evidence, and it's actually supposed to. So we'll finally be able to mark off that part of the chart. But again, I'm going to be releasing these videos at the beginning of every week as we keep going through all of this, just to give you all some time to be able to read over and listen and watch, and kind of formulate your own ideas, and maybe some questions that you can jump in on Saturday with, so we can start just going over the tasting and talk about pairing and interacting and having fun with everything like that. If you need anything, of course, call the club, call me. More than happy to talk about anything, especially when it comes to wine. But until Saturday, I'll see y'all then. But enjoy the rest of your week.